Let's dive right into this explainer. You probably already have an image burned into your brain from Zack Snyder's movie 300. You know the one. Chiseled Spartans in those bright crimson cloaks, standing defiant in a narrow pass, heroically defending Western freedom from Eastern tyranny. It's a thrilling, absolute blockbuster narrative of superhuman sacrifice that pretty much all of us are super familiar with.
Right. So, we all remember those blood-pumping scenes where King Leonidas snarls about fighting for freedom. He paints this vivid picture of a Persian army driven forward only by the terrifying whips of their masters, contrasting them with his own fiercely independent free men. But, as we look closely at the actual historical data today, we're going to uncover that almost everything about this clear-cut moral alignment is a historical lie.
It's kind of crazy to think about, isn't it? But if we peel back the layers of Hollywood myth-making and what historians call the Athenian romanticism of the Spartan Mirage, we have to ask a pretty terrifying question. What if the Spartans were actually the villains of the ancient world? Because the reality is, the state they built was one of the most brutal and totalitarian societies ever recorded.
Section 1. An empire built on slavery.
Okay, to understand the real Sparta, we have to recognize they weren't exactly these fearless, carefree heroes. Actually, they were a deeply anxious aristocracy, living on top of a ticking time bomb. And that bomb is perfectly represented by this staggering ratio, 7-to-1. See, the Spartans had invaded a neighboring region called Messenia and literally enslaved the entire ethnic population, turning them into state-owned serfs called Helots. The Helots did absolutely all the farming, the building, the manual labor, the whole shebang, which gave Spartan men the free time to train for war. But because the enslaved Helots outnumbered the citizens by at least 7-to-1, the Spartans lived in constant, absolute terror of a massive uprising.
So how did they maintain control over that massive population? They used a system of institutionalized terror enforced by something called the Cryptia. This was basically a secret police force where young Spartan men were sent out into the countryside, armed with absolutely nothing but knives. They'd hide out during the day, and by night, they assassinated any strong, smart, or defiant-looking Helots. It was a brutal way to essentially prune the population and keep the enslaved people completely disorganized and terrified.
Section 2. The brutal reality of training. The film loves to portray Spartan training as this noble crucible forging unbreakable men. But the reality of the Agoge system was way more akin to a curriculum of state-sponsored child abuse. It went like this. At just 7 years old, boys were taken from their mothers. They were deliberately starved to force them to steal food just to survive. And if they were caught, they were severely whipped. And get this, not for the moral failing of stealing, but for being incompetent enough to get caught in the first place. It was a cultural black hole specifically designed to beat out all individuality until the boy was completely, unquestionably subjugated to the state phalanx.
Section 3. Rethinking the Persian Empire.
Now, if the Spartans are the false heroes of this story, the Achaemenid Persian Empire, who are depicted on film as literal monsters, are its deeply maligned victims. The contrast here is just stark. While Sparta was this stagnant, xenophobic state completely reliant on mass slavery and institutional terror, the Achaemenid Persian Empire actually abhorred mass slavery. We literally have accounting tablets showing that when they built Persepolis, they paid their workers in silver, wine, and grain. And incredibly, they even granted women maternity leave. Under leaders like Cyrus the Great, they practiced remarkable religious tolerance, making it arguably the closest thing the ancient world had to a multicultural utopia.
Section 4. The true heroes at Thermopylae. Which brings us right back to that famous coastal pass in August 480 BCE. The enduring myth tells us exactly 300 Spartans stood entirely alone, right? Well, the numbers tell a very different story. King Leonidas actually brought a confederation of around 7,000 men. Yes, for sure, there were 300 Spartans, but there were also thousands of Peloponnesians, 400 Thebans, and 700 Thespians. Furthermore, the Hollywood narrative completely erases the fact that there were thousands of unnamed Helot slaves in the past, too. They were carrying armor, cooking food, and fighting and dying as light infantry right alongside their masters.
But here is the crucial point. What happened when the Greeks were eventually outflanked due to a local betrayal? Leonidas realized the position was totally lost. But the Spartans absolutely did not stay alone. 700 Thespians, and we're talking regular everyday potters, farmers, poets, and craftsmen, voluntarily chose to stay in the pass. They weren't genetically bred super soldiers forced by law to fight to the death. They fought and died out of pure, voluntary love for their city and for actual, real freedom.
Section 5. Sparta's Fall and Legacy.
Thermopylae obviously became this legendary propaganda victory, but once the Persian threat was expelled, Sparta quickly became the most hated oppressors in the Aegean. Eventually, their inherently flawed system caught up with them through a massive demographic crisis known as oliganthropia. Basically, because their citizenship was so strictly hereditary and exclusionary, anytime a Spartan died or lost his land, the pool of warriors permanently shrank. This severe shortage of men slowly turned their once mighty, terrifying army into a hollow shell that was propped up by reputation alone.
We can trace this collapse super clearly over time. From their legendary peak at Thermopylae in 480 BCE, they spent the late 5th century installing brutal oligarchies all across Greece. But the fatal turning point comes in 371 BCE. At the Battle of Leuctra, they clashed with the rising power of Thebes, and that supposedly invincible Spartan line was utterly crushed in open battle.
And the real champions of freedom emerged right here. The brilliant Theban general Epaminondas and his elite fighting force, the Sacred Band, didn't just beat Sparta on the battlefield, they marched directly into Spartan territory. They went straight to Messenia, declared the Helot slaves free, and built a massive new fortified city called Messene right on Sparta's doorstep. By liberating that enslaved workforce, they destroyed the entire foundation of the Spartan economy, literally overnight.
Section 6. Why the myth matters today. So if Sparta ultimately collapsed into a second-rate power, literally becoming a bizarre tourist attraction where wealthy Romans later visited just to watch them whip children for entertainment, why do we still cling so tightly to this myth? Impartially looking at the data presented in the historical source material, the Spartan Mirage actually began with ancient Athenian philosophers who romanticized their strict order. In the modern era, the sources note that this stylized aesthetic myth has been adopted by various ideological movements. According to the historical texts, 19th century imperialists, 20th century Nazis who admired their eugenics, and modern alt-right paramilitaries have all utilized Spartan iconography. The source material points out that these groups often romanticize the hyper-masculinity and violence while totally overlooking the historical realities, the institutionalized mass slavery, the state-sponsored child abuse, and the severe cultural oppression.
Ultimately, history is rarely a simple battle of good versus evil, right? It is a messy, gray tapestry of human ambition and survival.
Please like and subscribe.